Welcome back to the Public Sector Sales Podcast. I'm Lloyd from Tussle, and today we're going to be talking about the new Procurement Act, which is set to launch in October 2024. This is a seismic shift for the public sector in all things procurement, and I'm joined today by Shailee Howard from law firm Mills & Reeve. Shailee, thanks for joining us, and can you give everyone a quick intro into yourself and what you do?
Yep, thanks so much for having me. So I'm Shailee. I'm a public procurement specialist at law firm Mills & Reeve. And we advise contracting authorities, so across central government, NHS, education, as well as private sector suppliers bidding into the public sector on all things procurement. So get involved right from the beginning in terms of procurement strategy, sort of running the procurement, and also sort of supporting when it goes wrong as well.
It's really interesting and pertinent with everything that's coming up. You're going to be very, very busy, I think, over the next year or so.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, look, let's get straight into it.
Great.
The Procurement Act is coming in October 2024, so later this year. When the process started out, I think the goal was to try and make public procurement simpler, more flexible and more effective. As far as I can tell so far, based on the new rules, we've got new procedures and systems to learn. We've got more administration, especially with more notices to published. Seemingly some flexibility, but perhaps alongside some new grey areas as a result. Still no unified approach across devolved nations with kind of separate regs there, and a continued carve out in separate processes for things like NHS, defence and utilities. So with that in mind, do you feel the new regime has really delivered on those objectives, particularly around simplicity for procurement teams, and is there some obvious upside for procurement teams that I've missed?
It's a really good question. I mean, this really is the biggest change in a generation that we've seen. I think there was a real sense right back from when the Green Paper was published back in December 2021 that given that we have departed from the EU, this is a real opportunity for the UK to sort of forge its own way and really up the ante in terms of becoming a world-class procurement, a public sector procurement function. And I guess I think that there are probably two elements to how to view the new regime. Firstly, I think there's a more expansive view of the life of a public contract. So the rules really do have something to say right from your planning in terms of your pipeline of potential notices all the way through to contract termination. So you're right that there's absolutely much more sort of regulation in terms of each of those stages. But having said that, we have the competitive flexible procedure, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about. And that really, the idea behind that is to really empower authorities to set their procurement the way they want to. I mean, to answer your question, I think with flexibility, that doesn't necessarily mean simplicity. And I think sometimes the two are conflated. But actually, where you are allowing your public sector buyers that flexibility to procure something that really fits their requirements, that might mean that that's not necessarily as simple as you might want it to be.
Yeah, I can see that, and I think that flexibility as a kind of ex-procurement person myself, it's exciting that that's there and it's kind of encouraging, but with it come some new grey areas, if you like.
I think so. And I suppose you've got to have, if you're a public sector purchaser, you'll need to have the resources and the knowledge in place at that time to really benefit from those flexibilities.
Absolutely. Okay, so getting into the kind of weeds of this a little bit now. Let's say I'm a category manager working in central government. How's life really going to be different for me? Let's say in November 2024, the new regs are in place. How's life really going to change on a day-to-day basis, and how will I feel it in my role day to day?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on how you're looking at it. So I suppose from a macro level, if you sort of zoom out a little bit, not much is changing in terms of coverage, thresholds. The exemptions are sort of as they are now. Contract modification is broadly the same. And also those principles of transparency and equal treatment will continue to apply. So I guess in terms of the basics, procurement will continue to cover what it currently covers. But in terms of the day-to-day detail, I think it will feel quite different. So the processes themselves, you have effectively the open procedure and then the competitive flexible flexible procedure, and there's nothing really in between. And you can design that as you see fit, sort of subject to some safeguards, which I think is quite different to the rigid processes that we currently use. And I know that my sense from talking to our public sector clients is that there's a fear that everyone will revert back to the restricted procedure. It's what we know and love. It works well. But actually, I think the message from central government is to really empower authorities to tweak those processes if they need to. I suppose another feature that will change on a day-to-day basis is the central digital platform. So there are plans to have this central digital platform, which effectively will be an expanded version of the Find a Tender service system. And that will house notices, supplier registration and supplier information as well. And each procurement authority and supplier will have its own unique identifier. And again, that's to really increase the level of transparency that will feature all the way throughout the procurement life cycle. There will also be, in terms of terminology, that'll be quite different. So we've gone from the public contracts regulations through to the Procurement Act. So your references might look different. There is some change of terminology. So for example, selection questions will now be conditions of participation and things like that. Those are just a few good old standstill letters, so they won't exist anymore. So we have something called assessment summaries. There are lots more that I think as a category manager, you'll sort of have to get your head round. Another key feature, I suppose, are the new purchasing tools as well. So you have frameworks, which we could probably spend a good half an hour on just in and of themselves, and dynamic purchasing systems are now dynamic markets. So they've both had a bit of a revamp. And I think if I was sitting with a requirement and wondering how best to procure it, I'll have a lot more options available to me to think about whether those are right for that particular procurement. And finally, I suppose there are loads more notices. I think that's probably a key feature. I know it's been talked about a lot. There are notices right from sort of pipeline notices for an authority all the way through to contract termination. So in terms of the level of resource that's going to be needed to keep track of what those notices are and when you need to publish them, I think that's probably something that you're going to have to get your head around quite quickly.
Absolutely, and that's one obviously very close to our hearts at Tussell, knowing the amount of new notices that are coming through, the new notice types, something we're getting set up for right now. But yeah, there's certainly more administration in that, but having that extra transparency for sure is something that we think will be really beneficial for kind of public sector at large. So thank you for that. It sounds like, again, the theme of more flexibility coming in, things for people to learn and get their head round, but lots of interesting new kind of processes to work with. Next, I wanted to talk to you about the data side of things in more detail. So you mentioned those notices and then the transparency data under the new regime. Can you give us some examples of the types of notices that are kind of new and people might expect versus the notices that are out there right now?
So I suppose, as I said, it all begins with the pre-procurement stage. So you will have the planned procurement notice, which it's a bit like the PIN, the prior information notice that we've got now. So that sort of looks the same. You then have a pipeline notice, and that's quite new. And effectively, that means that if you're going to spend £100 million or more in the next financial year, then you have to itemise all contracts that you're going to enter into, which are valued over £2 million. So it's really using your crystal ball to anticipate exactly what's coming up, what might need to be procured, and that will include potential direct awards as well. And again, it's just to give transparency over what's coming up. I mean, central government are quite used to doing this already, but it's really expanding the scope of that to the whole of the public sector. You also have pre-market engagement notices as well. Again, operate a bit like a PIN now. I suppose in terms of new notices in the tender phase, you also have the tender notice, which is a bit like the contract notice now, your sort of shop window of your procurement. But then you also have a transparency notice. So if you are, as an authority, making a direct award, then you've got to set out what that is and what the justification is for that. You then have a contract award notice, which is not the old style contract award notice. It's effectively the start of the standstill period that's communicated to the whole market. At that point, that's when any unsuccessful bidders would get their assessment summaries or sort of old style standstill letters. Assuming you've got to the end of that process without any challenges or pauses, then the authority would have to publish something called a contract details notice. And so again, that's different. It's sort of separating out the old style contract award notice into two. So one you do before the standstill period and one you do at the end once you've awarded the contract. And then I suppose finally you have the procurement termination notice as well, and that does what it says on the tin really. So when a contract has either terminated or been abandoned, then again that's something that you need to tell the market. I suppose the key thing to know is that really an interested party should be able to follow a contract all the way through from its inception all the way through to the end. There's a whole bulk of notices around the contract management phase, and that's new. So the payments compliance notice. So is the authority a good customer who pays on time? Again, one of the key themes of the Procurement Act is to open up procurement to SMEs and to suppliers who might not ordinarily bid for public sector contracts. There is going to be greater transparency over the extent to which authorities are actually paying their suppliers on time. In certain circumstances as well, there's a need for a contract performance notice. So where you have a contract that's valued over £5 million, then the authority has to set and publish at least 3 key performance indicators, which again is something that I think has created a little bit of nervousness and uncertainty for both authorities and suppliers who are going to have their performance sort of out there for everybody to see. And that's got to be reported on every year and at the end of the contract as well.
I'm really intrigued by those KPI performance notices, because I know there are some that exist in at the moment for very, very large contracts, but they're kind of few and far between. And knowing how the market reacts to that, I can see it being a very interesting situation when suppliers' performance is put out there and how they react to it. And I really wonder how contracting authorities will deal with those notices and kind of how much information really flows through, or whether there's somehow some kind of vanilla response to people saying everyone's doing okay because they know the repercussions.
Absolutely, exactly. And I think just on that, I suppose, I mean, again, like I say, central government are quite used to doing this, and you can actually have a look at the data that's published. I had a look at it a couple of weeks ago, and there are a hell of a lot of social value KPIs on there, which I suppose is not really the point. And I wonder whether this is an area where we'll see some guidance from central government about the kinds of KPIs that authorities should be setting and reporting on, and sort of what happens. And I guess there's also a link, if you're a supplier, to potential exclusion from future procurements for poor performance. So if you've had a contract terminated for poor performance, and the rules are slightly tweaked in that regard under the Act, then if you've got your performance there for everybody to see, it doesn't take much for a competitor supplier to sort of join the dots about, well, you know, their performance hasn't been great over the last however long of reporting. What does that mean for termination?
There's a lot in there. It's really a lot. It really struck me as you were going through the different notices as well, just how much is changing. I mean, we've seen it and read it ourselves, but actually when you talk about it in that sense, the whole life cycle, it's really going to impact things, I think, a lot from a transparency point of view. So. I just wanted to touch on as well, before we move on, this pipeline point, because in our experience, customers have this feeling that a pipeline can come out, or a buyer says, I'm going to do something in X amount of time. And sometimes a huge amount of investment is made in preparing for that bid and being ready for it. And then suddenly it just disappears from these pipelines as well. So from a bidder's perspective, that can be quite frustrating when they've invested time in getting ready for something that they expect to come down the line and it doesn't. So it'll be really interesting as more of those notices start to come out, if that behaviour changes, or if procurement teams are waiting until they're more certain that things will go into their pipeline before they publish them. So yeah, there's lots of interesting things to get to there. But getting back on track before if I take us off piste a bit too much, Shailee. So let's talk about kind of existing procurements that are impacted as we go into this kind of transition period and the kind of changeover between the regulations. So let me run us through a few scenarios with you, if that's okay. So the first one, a mini competition run under an existing framework which used the existing procurement regulations. So a framework was put in place with the old regs, and then we're now in, I don't know, December 2024, and someone wants to run a mini competition. What happens there?
So that would be conducted under the old rules. So the transition period, transition provisions are, we don't have the final rules, but based on the draft regulations, we're expecting the final regulations sort of any minute now. That will continue under the old rules. So the idea is if you've started a procurement under the old rules, it will continue even if it's a framework agreement.
Got you. So that one's nice and easy.
Okay,
yeah. Good. The second one, an existing £20 million per annum contract that runs for the next 3 years. Yeah. What about things like contract changes and KPIs? Will the new rules be followed down or not?
Again, it would be the old rules for that one as well. I mean, you may well find that suppliers are asking more questions about performance, maybe through freedom of information, because as I guess if you're a supplier, you'd think, well, you've got to do this under new contracts, and therefore is that something you could answer, even though the contract was procured under the old regime? The position on contract sort of changes, I suppose, is quite interesting. I think, as we understand it, the old rules will continue to apply, but like I say, there's some regulations out there, and we're just waiting for confirmation of that position.
Okay, good. I fear that my last question might be in the same position, but let's ask anyway. So a PIN is put out, a prior information notice is put out as part of a procurement process, and a pre-market engagement is conducted.
Yeah.
A tender is then published, say the day before the new regulations come in, and finally a contract is awarded, not a framework, just a standard contract, well after the launch date. Is it the same?
Same position, yeah. Okay. So as we understand it, the PIN doesn't matter for the purposes of when a tender has commenced. Yeah. So the draft regulations say that it's when your contract notice is published. So actually you could have a scenario. So in that scenario you've described, it would very much be under the old rules, but I suppose you could also have, PIN is published, there's a whole load of market engagement that continues now, and actually the contract notice is published. And so you may well be having discussions with your suppliers around what the process looks like, etc. But actually then your notice isn't published until the day after. And then implementation, then it would be the new rules. Yeah.
So it's that first contract notice, and is it called a tender notice in the new
It's got
world?
a tender notice, and I'm going to have to remember the new lingo.
I'm glad I'm good on listening properly. So the tender notice starts the day after the new regulations have come in, then the new rules apply, regardless of what's happened before. Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. That's right. I'm learning as I go today. So on to the next question. I kind of have this fear that with this new competitive flexible procedure that's coming in, it could lead to a bit of a kind of wild west of procurement, where procurement professionals feel that they can kind of do whatever they want within reason. How can practitioners make sure they're getting the benefit of the new procedure type, but without running procurement processes which break the rules?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think effectively a procurement practitioner's North Star should really be transparency, equal treatment, proportionality, ensuring sort of value for money, public benefit. Those are all sort of really key themes that permeate their way through the Act. So those will all continue to apply. I think, again, this is something that I know the Cabinet Office are at pains to emphasise, is that it's really helpful to use pre-market engagement to help design your competitive flexible procedure as well, and to help you get an understanding of what's actually right for whatever it is that you're procuring. So it might be that site visits are necessary and useful, product demos, as long as you're doing those, in an objective way. and setting out clearly exactly how you're planning on evaluating those things, and then there's no reason why you can't use those things. You may well decide to have dialogue or negotiation or some sort of engagement, like a lean dialogue or procurement process. I think that would work. But I guess with all of that, the tender notice is really critical, because that is, as I said, your shop window, and the accompanying documents that sort of are published alongside that as well, to really give suppliers an understanding of what you're doing. There are actually rules around refining your award criteria as well, which as a procurement lawyer sort of made me take a slight sharp intake of breath, because if you've started a procurement process and then you're changing the award criteria, that's effectively, there's a risk of moving the goalposts. But there are some conditions around when that can be used. So you've got to make sure it doesn't impact on the shortlisting that's happened beforehand. You've still got to make sure you're maintaining equal treatment. But there is some more flexibility there. But I suppose to go back to your question, I guess the key is really planning and anticipating sort of exactly what it is that you might need, and using intel from the market to help inform that decision.
Let's talk about dynamic markets. So what are they, and how are they different to DPSs?
Yeah, so they're effectively rebranded DPSs. They're largely the same, although I think there's an intention that they'll be used sort of more widely, or a hope that they'll be used more widely, not just for sort of commodity type purchases. I suppose what I think is more interesting is sort of the ambit of purchasing tools that are available. So you have framework agreements, which are largely the same with slightly different rules around duration. But you've also got this concept of an open framework as well, which, again, going back to the green paper, people got quite excited about, given it was sort of effectively meant to be sort of an open framework where anyone could sort of hop on or hop off. But actually what we've ended up with in the Act is almost a series of successive frameworks where there are sort of key windows where you can have new suppliers on. And again, I think this is an area where we're going to see lots more guidance around exactly how that's going to operate. But I suppose if you've got a requirement as a contracting authority that's not going to change very much, but you've got to run sort of regular framework agreements for, I think the open framework could be quite a neat solution.
Yeah, I think it's interesting from both sides. We hear a lot from suppliers about being locked out of those frameworks, and it's very real for them. We can expose when that framework is interesting for somebody to bid on, especially through call-off data that we have on those frameworks as well. But that frustration around, I have to wait now for another 3 years or 4 years. So knowing that those open frameworks are available and that window open, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think they sort of plug, the way I sort of see it working is they plug that gap between a sort of closed framework and a dynamic market that takes quite a lot of active management on the part of the authority. And as I guess an open framework is something that's sort of in between those two things.
Most advantageous tender, or MAT, versus most economically advantageous tender, or MEAT, from the old rules. I've always found that a bit of a mouthful. They sound very similar, but what does the change really mean for procurement teams?
Yeah, I think this area of the Act has really had a bit of a spotlight shone on it and has sparked quite a lot of interest. I would probably describe it more as a shift of emphasis as opposed to a real sea change. You've still got to make sure that your criteria are clear. You've got to publish them. They've got to be, they can't sort of be biased in any way. And they've got to be related to the contract as well. So even though you've taken the economic bit out of it, that's not to say that you're still not evaluating price, and it's still very much got to be related to the contract. I mean, it is possible to have criteria which are aimed at sort of non-price or cost elements. I think this is an area where things like the National Policy Procurement Statement is going to be important. So that's in the Act. We have it at the moment. It's effectively the policy objectives of procurement that the government of the day wants to use procurement to implement. And the latest version of the NPPS is being consulted on at the moment. Current priorities include things like creating new businesses, creating new jobs and new skills, tackling climate change, reducing waste, improving supply diversity, and so on and so forth. So I think the change from meet to match really does allow authorities to think about those more value-based criteria. And this, I think, is an area where pre-market engagement is going to be really important. So making sure that your suppliers can actually deliver whatever it is that you want them to deliver as part of the procurement, and also that it's relevant, and you are really pushing your suppliers to provide the best offer that they possibly can. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't challenges with using value-based criteria. So you still need to think about things like equal treatment, transparency, and proportionality as well.
Yeah, I think it gives you a lot more flexibility, or at least it kind of encourages. I think it encourages procurement practitioners to just think about their criteria a little bit differently. So maybe not that much has changed in reality around kind of how people might be doing the job day to day, but even just that push to say you can think around wider and more qualitative type points as well. So an important change, I think. So let's be honest, Shailee, I don't think every single procurement practitioner is going to read the new Procurement Act from cover to cover. So assuming that some don't read it all, with that in mind, what are the kind of top 5 things that they should really take notice of? What are your kind of key takeaways from the Act?
Well, okay, I guess if you're not going to read it, that's fine. But I suppose firstly, I would think about the transitional arrangements. So do you understand those? Which of your contracts are coming up for renewal? Are they going to be covered under the old regime or the new regime? I think that's going to be job number one. Secondly, I think the new notices regime is going to be really important. There's going to be, as I understand it, a phased approach to sort of those notices. The notices regime, as we've said, is extensive, and it is also mandatory as well. So you'll need to build in time to think about each of those. And given that they cover contract management as well, I think one of the key things that we've noticed is that greater collaboration between what might potentially be 2 separate teams within an organisation, sort of commercial procurement team, as well as the contract management team. I think there's going to have to be a lot more closer working. So starting to get those processes in place, I think, will be important. I guess number 3 on my list would be sort of standstill periods, and the processes around the end of the process. So getting assessment summaries in order. Standstill letters are actually going to be a bit easier to draft going forward, but also looking at notice requirements around the end of the process and being ready at that stage. Number 4, I think, would be contract management and sort of performance reporting. So as we talked about KPIs, if you have contracts that are covered by that requirement to publish those KPIs, what that's going to look like, and making sure that you're not missing those deadlines to report on those for each of your contracts. And then finally, I think, making the most of the competitive flexible procedure. So I'd be thinking a lot about building in the time to design processes that are going to work better for you, and really, taking advantage of those flexibilities.
Some really great tips there. I think the last one in particular, this new kind of flexible procedure, is kind of, it's a really exciting one for procurement practitioners, I think, to see what they're capable of and kind of how it can be used. What aspect of the reforms are you most excited about? What do you expect to have the most positive impact on procurement that's actually happening in the UK public sector once the new rules are in place?
I suppose we spend quite a lot of time advising authorities on trying to sort of work out the narrative of a procurement. So sort of to build up a picture of sort of what happened, how the procurement went, how many suppliers were interested, and sort of what issues arose, and all the different tools and levers that you have during a procurement process to sort of tweak those things. And I think what the Act really requires of practitioners is to think about all those things as much as possible from the outset. So for me, that's quite an interesting change in emphasis of empowering and informing procurement practitioners to really think quite carefully about what it is they're procuring and taking a bit more of a contract-specific role to procurement, as opposed to, well, this is the way we did it last time, and therefore, for me, that I think there's a real benefit or potential benefit in doing things that way. I guess my sort of procurement litigation colleagues might also wonder sort of what the changes and what effects the new Act is going to have on the challenge requirement. I think one thing we've not really talked about is the procurement review unit that's set up, and that's going to have much more of a role in sort of identifying thematic issues. So again, I think that, thinking about that whole idea of levelling up procurement and elevating the way procurement is done in this country, I think the interplay between things that bidders are going to complain about, whether that's in the courts or with the procurement review unit, and sort of what's happening then in terms of change of policy, I think that's going to be really interesting.
Good. Final question. What advice would you give to procurement teams and contracting authorities to best prepare for the new Act ahead of its go live in October 2024?
I guess I would say make sure you're signed up to all the government training. So the Cabinet Office is doing lots and lots at the moment. You have the knowledge drops, which are out. They're really short videos, and they are split into sort of authorities, also sort of at an exec level as well, sort of very high level, also for suppliers as well. So have a look at those, and they will give you sort of the bare bones of sort of what's changing. I would also sort of start to do the work around identifying those first contracts that may well potentially fall under the regime. There is lots and lots of information that's out there to help you prepare. So I think I would sort of keep an eye on mailing lists, etc. Because I know there's going to be a lot of sort of distilling of all of that complex detail into sort of practical guidance.
Yeah, I think that's key. There's going to be lots of keen training providers talking about this stuff for quite a while. I think that's welcomed as people get adjusted to the new rules and the new Act. Shailee, that's all of my questions for today. Thank you so much for coming in and speaking to us. It's been super informative, really, really helpful, and I hope everybody listening enjoyed it as well. How can people get in touch with you if they'd like to discuss anything further?
So we are the law firm behind the procurement portal. So it's quite a popular website. So there's lots of information on there. We've got a dedicated page on reform, where you'll find a vlog with me and my colleagues talking about each of the features of the Act and the implications. We're also the firm behind 5 and 25 webinars, which are hugely popular. They're all there as well for you to see. Do have a look at that.
Thank you so much. We'll put all of your details in the video and in the blogs that accompany this podcast. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this Public Sector Sales podcast. If you'd like to see more of these, you can head over to our YouTube channel, head over to the Tussle website, www.tussle.com, and also sign up for our mailing list. Thanks for listening and watching, and we'll see you soon.